Welcome back to Ziggurat. This time we'll be playing as Kraz, the Novice. She is the first character most people unlock, and she is a very good character for learning the ropes, as it were. Characters in this game come with both upsides and downsides, and Kraz is actually pretty similar to the vanilla guy we start with. As you can see, her wand fires a bit faster, and as shown in the perk view, it also regenerates its ammo faster. Its biggest advantage by far, however, is the fact that it has double the capacity of Argo's wand. Where he has to make do with measly 50 shots, we can fire off 100. Now, since the weapon we picked up we've seen before, let's talk a bit more about the specifications of this character. The downside she pays for having an amazing wand is having slightly lower mana pools. This is actually a bigger issue than it seems initially, because it does mean that not only we have a lower mana capacity overall, but also that ammo pickups do less for us, because they are percentage based. What this means in practical terms is that Kraz is really good at clearing out the early floors, say levels 1 and 2 of the Ziggurat, but she hits a wall when the wand's damage starts dropping off. This means that her main priority, in order to survive the Ziggurat, is to get perks that manage to overcome this disadvantage, either by increasing her mana pools or by finding alternate means of recharging the weapons. The perk we just picked up, Revenge, doesn't help with either, but it's a completely awesome perk either way. And it has saved my ass more than a couple times during the game and during this round. Also, remember what I said about Milkstone Studios' previous games? Raventhorn? Seriously? That's like a fanfiction.net title. Now, in the room we are about to enter, we'll have our first random modifier. They are this game's way of keeping things fresh and interesting, and well, some of them succeed, some of them make rooms a lot more fun, and some of them are a complete pain in the ass. This one is pretty much a straight out difficulty increase. Thankfully we're still in the first 4, and the enemies here aren't exactly tough, so it doesn't really do much. You'll notice that I picked up a perk that makes experience gems provide a small amount of mana, and it's a first step on our way to fix Kraz's mana problems. Speaking of which, Kraz's wand. Every character in this game has their own wand. They not only function differently, but also look differently. We can't really see it because of all the perks we start with, but Kraz's wand is actually very similar to the one Argo starts with. The only difference is the double mana capacity and a slightly weaker secondary fire. Argo fires 5 pellets with 1 salvo, Kraz fires 4. This also serves as a very good introduction into how heavily stacked perks can completely change the way you're playing. Anyway, we're running into some new enemies here, so let's talk about them a bit. The flying things that spit out 3 flames are called imps, and they are a massive pain in the ass. They actually weren't present in the game upon release. They were added with a patch about a month after it went gold, and honestly the game could have done without them. They underwent some balance changes since then. They used to be much faster, but they still remain a very strong reminder of why adding half-assed content after your game is done is not always the best of ideas. Right, Hoki? Non-animal lovers will pay closer attention to the fact that we entered a room with a treasure chest. Treasure chests contain a random reward, in our case a perk, or they can set up an ambush on you. But because said ambush is a normal fight with experience rewards, there is pretty much no reason not to open them. There are perks that allow you to manipulate treasure rooms to an extent, and they are very useful if you can manage to get your hands on them early enough, but that's a pretty big if. Now, the room we're about to enter right now is about to prove me wrong about what I said in the last video about the Scarab Staff's bounce effect not being useful. Thankfully, we're fighting in a small room here, and those little shards managed to turn it into hell on earth for those poor basilisks. So thanks, bouncy shards. At the level up screen you'll notice that I opted for a perk that gives me a short invulnerability period when I pick up experience gem instead of more mana steal, and I freely admit that that was probably a mistake. My reasoning for this is simply that I do like to have access to more than one defensive option in my build, and having just revenge generally isn't enough to keep me alive with all the shit that flies around in the lower levels. And not just lower levels, since we just cleared out a room full of banshees. There is not much to that enemy. They fly and they occasionally fire off a 4 or 5 shot salvo that spreads in a semi-random pattern, but those projectiles are really fast and they are hard to dodge efficiently, so most of the time it's a better idea to just take them, or try to get something that will give you that invincibility frame. Now we have thoroughly cleansed the entire floor of enemies. Let's use the portal key and see what it calls upon us. Okay, Gunkar. Gunkar is a bigger version of an enemy I don't think we've seen yet, and he's a complete chump. He has a grand total of 2 attacks. 1, he creates a small shockwave in front of him. 2, he jumps and creates a bigger circular shockwave you have to jump over. The real problem with him is that he for some reason summons banshees, but even that's not going to save him from my wand. Now a big factor in Ziggurat is economics of health and mana, and weighing your risks carefully and picking the fights you can pick. Now the bosses actually managed to be a pretty damn good way of checkpointing in this way, because they're not only a big inevitable risk you know you have to deal with at some point and you need to judge when to take them on, but there's also a huge reward because they always drop both health and mana. This has some pretty interesting effects. For example, if you're low on both health and mana and you have a portal key and know where the boss room is, you can always gamble on getting a boss you know how to deal with, like say Gunkar, and use that as a boost that would allow you to clear the rest of the floor. And that is because often the rest of the floor will contain rooms that are much riskier than a boss is. Case in point, rooms with the faster enemies modifier. Granted, this depends a lot on the enemies actually present in the room, but in general seeing this message is always bad news. By the way, 2 completely worthless perks in there. Torture actually may have some use with poisonous weapons, and it would be interesting if there was a character built around that as a gimmick, but alas there isn't, and as it is, it's really hard to justify taking enough levels at this in order to make it worth it. Now, with our first entrance to a new level, there's a lot to talk about, specifically weapons, enemies and layouts, so I'll run a bit of a checklist here. Let's start with the layouts. The levels are procedurally generated and the algorithm for this does not change. The floors will look somewhat different and they will start introducing new types of rooms on the lower levels, but in general they'll just be getting bigger. Even those new rooms I was talking about are mainly little twists, like starting to trap portal rooms and the little passages that connect the rooms in themselves. The slightly different look of this floor also has another rather annoying factor to it, and that's the fact that I'm not even going to try to look for the secret room in this rock texture thing, because I don't think I've ever found one in any other way than accidentally blasting it open in a fight. Now, one of those rooms that I think can't show up on the first floor is the obelisk rooms. They are a giant pain in the ass, and at least as far as I'm concerned, the most consistent cause of my deaths in this game. It works like this. In obelisk rooms, enemies don't spawn normally. The enemy spawns are tied to a series of 1 to, I believe, 5 stupid looking glowy rocks spread in a random pattern above the room. As long as there's a rock on the room, enemies are spawning. This sounds like a perfect grinding opportunity, except it isn't, because the only drops you'll get in an obelisk rooms are from the obelisks themselves. Now this is perfectly fine as long as the room doesn't spawn enemies capable of zoning you, but that's a pretty huge group of enemies. So what this means in reality is that while you're hounded by an above average amount of enemies all around the room, they are not only keeping you away from being able to deal more damage and stop them from spawning, but they're also preventing you from picking up those all-important mana and experience drops. I think they actually drop somewhat more experience and pickups than the normal rooms, so there's some risk-reward ratio, but still, fuck obelisks. Now, let's talk a bit more about the weapons. The weapon balance in Ziggurat is sadly all over the place, but that kind of helps to make it a bit more fun, because probably the biggest appeal of entering a new level is that you'll find a new weapon at the beginning. And the weapon I got on this floor is completely fucking awesome. Spells generally are. There are 4 categories of weapons: spells, staves and alchemy. Each of them is represented by a color and they have their own specifications. Shit, interrupting for a religious interlude. Temple rooms we could have found on first floor, but we haven't seen any yet. Each of them contains 3 shrines. In order to pray at a shrine you need to sacrifice something. Well, there's one that doesn't require a sacrifice, but the other 2 will always want some amount of mana and some amount of health. The rewards for this are completely random, and they can help you immensely as well as completely fuck you over. They can heal you, they can hurt you, they can buff you, they can debuff you, and they can do fun stuff like completely shuffling your mana pools or replacing your weapons with different ones. As far as I can tell, the benefits usually outweigh the disadvantages, and it's almost always worth doing it, especially when they require a mana type you are not using. Anyway, we've seen this trap room before, so back where I was before I got rudely interrupted by God. The weapon types are differentiated. We have the blue spells that usually have special effects that work on long range. We have green staves, which are usually rapid fire and specialize in dealing with mass of enemies. And we have orange alchemy, which is slow and strong and expensive, but can blow up half the room in one shot, if you manage to find a good one. Now, the reason I'm talking about this is that the spell I picked up at the start of the floor is of a very specific type. The Skull of Xanatos is an AoE homing spell. It's not very inventive. The primary fire shoots a skull, the secondary fire shoots a bigger skull, but it more than makes up for that in its power and especially utility. You see, and that's probably the biggest complaint people have about Ziggurat, in this game homing weapons are the shit. It's fairly reasonable, really. In games like this, where most enemies use projectile weapons that you are supposed to be able to dodge, which is why I'm referring to them more as first-person platformers than shooters, because the emphasis is on dodging and navigating the environment, which is out to kill you, obviously, but perhaps the same could be said of all video games. Now, the thing about this type of game is that in order to be successful at it, you need to learn to balance between offense and defense. If you go on an all-out offensive, you have a chance of disposing of the enemies before they manage to do you any serious harm. However, you will inevitably take some damage in the process. Now, if you stay on the defensive, you may be able to dance between the bullets perfectly, but you may also be stuck there forever simply because the bullets keep coming. A balanced approach is therefore required. Now, in a first-person game, offense is usually represented by aiming, either by trying to line up that perfect shot, or simply by holding the crosshair on the enemy so all of your projectiles hit. The thing is, this leads to tunnel vision, therefore your defense goes to hell. And this is why in Ziggurat, homing weapons reign supreme. They remove an entire one side of the equation. This obviously makes the game easier, and absurdly so. Most of the people's first successful runs, as a matter of fact, were when they managed to luck out on finding a homing spell early on. Because with one of those, and a decent selection of perks that allow you to just keep living and chucking it in the general direction of the enemy, you can beat just about anything. Now, this fact is responsible for a lot of the negative reputation Ziggurat got. And while I agree it's not exactly the soundest design decision they could have made, it's not like anyone forces you to use the things at the expense of other weapons. I mean, okay, you get an average of 5 weapons per run, and it takes up a third of your ammunition pool, but still, I don't think the homing weapons quite destroy the gameplay. They don't exactly enhance it, sure, but let's face it, a lot of the roguelikes are kind of gambling on you abusing the system for the purpose of fully beating them. And broken items, and especially broken combinations of items and levels, are a pretty common thing in any game that depends on random generation heavily. Speaking of random, our new modifier, hiccups, it actually does exactly what it sounds like. Your character will occasionally hiccup and that will make you jump. It's honestly more amusing than anything else, unless you have about 10 health, because then it becomes deadly serious, because it's entirely possible to hiccup into a projectile. I've had it happen before. Now, I know I haven't been explaining all the enemies in the game, but I believe these guys deserve an explanation. The big golem fires an icy salvo, and when it dies it turns into 2 small golems that attack you on melee range, and that explode when they die. The real problem here is the drop distribution, because the experience and mana is actually dropped by the big one. Which brings me to the final point I wanted to make in this video, and that's enemies. Each of these enemies is a gimmick. Each of these enemies is working on a simple pattern, fires a projectile that can be avoided if you learn its pattern, and each of these enemies on its own is a complete chump. They only have their one thing. They have no AI to speak of. They aren't real enemies, they're obstacles. They are Koopas, they are badniks. And this is a platformer, where they are really just requiring you to step in one particular way. It's not about aiming your wand at the enemies and blowing them up. It's about doing it while tap dancing. And that, I think, is the ultimate and main source of disappointment people had with Ziggurat. Because at its heart, it is very much not a shooter or an RPG. The weapons feel weak, the level design is nonsensical, there's absolutely no pacing, the rooms look horrible. There's really only one type of action game genre in which this is possible. And sadly, Ziggurat was not marketed as it. Now, I sadly don't have enough data to prove or disprove this hypothesis conclusively, but I think Ziggurat would be much more appreciated by platformer players than FPS and RPG players who bought it based on its premise. There's a long tradition of action games that place equal emphasis on movement and shooting, and people tend to completely love them or completely hate them. And oh wait, here's a boss. Lady Audrey, and by god that's a stupid name, is a bigger version of one of those plant things I've talked at length about earlier. She, however, works a lot differently. Yes, she is more or less invulnerable while she's closed, but her fighting style is much more insidious. Her main source of damage and annoyance and anything else, really, is summoning other plants. She summons those vines that create a sort of a thorny shockwave that heads in your general direction and is best sidestepped, which gets rather more complicated when there's more of them around. What's more, the way to actually get her to open up is to kill those. You can't get her to open up simply by firing at her. You need to either wait some time or kill enough of those plants. I'm honestly not sure, because if you're waiting and not killing the plants, you're dead. Now, this doesn't really look so bad if you're a human lawnmower or something along these lines, but once she gets under half health, she mixes it up a bit and starts summoning another type of plant. Just an aside, I think she's the only boss in the game that behaves this way. Some of them will get more aggressive as their health goes on, but I believe she's the only one who gains a completely new attack. Now, the new type of enemy she summons fires the same kind of shot the regular plant enemies do. Oh, by the way, I think they're called rotten stems or something similarly stupid, especially on the account of the fact that they don't have a stem at all. Now, the real threat of those is the fact that their projectiles actually home in on you. It's not very good homing, and they are very slow, so it's not like they're going to track you around the room or anything. Revenants, they ain't. But it's homing nonetheless, and when you just add it to the fact that you are already sidestepping and jumping over shockwaves and trying to get a clear line of sight to the Queen Bitch plant herself, yeah, it's a pretty intense battle. Also, interestingly enough, it's a battle in which homing weapons don't help you in the slightest because there's just so much other shit they will hit. All in all, I'd say it's a pretty good boss fight. It manages to hit on just about the right combination of frustration and satisfaction. Anyway, that's it for this part of the run. Next time we follow Kraz into the third level of the Ziggurat.